Hello, everybody. Welcome to the EAZA Animal Welfare Webinar for October. My name's Ellen Williams. I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. I'm joined behind the scenes by Sally Binding. Sally is going to be helping us if we have any technical difficulties. So we'll drop her email in the chat in a moment. If you do have any problems and you can't get back into the webinar, then please do just drop Sally an email and she'll be able to help you. Whilst the webinar is on, please keep your mics muted so we don't have interference, but you're very welcome to have your cameras on. Today it gives me absolute great pleasure to introduce Dr. Fay Clark. Fay is a UK-based academic and she's interested in comparative mental processes and the mental health of animals. She is working currently at the University of Bristol where she leads the Comparative Challenge Lab, and she's developing cognitive tasks apparatuses to test cognitive skills and or to provide enrichment to impaired environments. Much of what Fay does looks at wild animals within zoological settings or research centres, and Fay is also an assistant director, a co-founder of the Many Zoos initiative, which aims to promote big team, open and reproducible zoo-based research. So today, Fay is going to be talking to us about the acoustic environment in zoos, and so looking at how we measure those environments and how we manage that as well in the zoos. So thank you very much, Fay. If anybody has any questions for Fay, please drop them in the chat as we go through, and then I'll invite you to say them out to Fay at the end. We've got a 45-minute presentation and then 15 minutes for questions. Thank you, Fay.
Thanks, Ellen. So yes, thank you to everybody for coming to my webinar this afternoon. It's great to see so many familiar faces. I was just looking through the attendees and obviously lots of new people as well. So I'm coming to you live from the University of Bristol for this talk in the UK, but this is also lots of collaborative work that I've been doing with Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge, also in the UK. So oh, there we go. Oops. Right. So hopefully we've got a really wide audience today. So I imagine that you have lots of different types of questions about sound in zoos, such as how your animals are using sound in their everyday lives to find food and mate and so on. But you also might be interested in the noise aspects of sound. So is any of the sound that's occurring in zoos noisy to your animals? So I've just put a couple of questions on this slide that you might have, that you might share. So I'm going to try and address the answers to all of these questions and more in my talk. But hopefully you can see that the main theme with all of these questions is the topic of sound management. So how do we actually go about monitoring and measuring sound in a zoo setting? So zoos are very soundful places. There's a lot of different sound that goes on in a zoo, and very broadly, we call the topic of studying sound in animals bioacoustics. So that covers all the different ways that animals produce, detect, discriminate and recognize and also respond to sound. And then we have these different categories of sound that are occurring in a zoo setting. We have our biophonic sounds. These are the sounds that the animals themselves are producing. These can be intentional vocalizations, or they could be incidental sounds. So maybe like trees rustling as the animal's moving along. Then we have geophonic sounds. These are sounds that are created by the physical environment, typically weather, but also just changes in the landscape. So they're probably not that common. But what we do have is this massively common category of sound, which is anthrophonic or anthropogenic sound. And these cover all the different sounds that are produced by humans. We have sounds that visitors make, such as their speech and their footfall. We have sounds that the enclosure makes, such as banking doors and HVAC or heating, ventilation and air conditioning. We have public announcement systems, different modes of transport making sounds. We have the sounds from special events, and we have sounds from construction machinery as well. So with all that in mind, I've tried to think about some objectives today that cover the things that I think people will want to know about sound measurement in zoos. So to do that, I'm going to have to start by briefly explaining the science behind sound, so what a sound wave is, and two sort of categories of sound wave that we need to look into when we're trying to measure sound. Then I'm going to try and summarize the effects of what we know about sound and noise on animal welfare so far, although this is a sort of emerging area of research. I'm going to try and spend most of my time convincing you to adopt some new measures or some new bioacoustic methods that have been used in other settings and the wild, and using those in zoos as opposed to just sticking with decibel measurement. And then I'm going to end with some more practical recommendations for how to monitor and manage unwanted sounds, otherwise known as noise, in zoos, and potentially add some beneficial sounds, which is acoustic enrichment. So let's start then with the science of sound. And it's important, I'm sure you already know that sound is a wave, but it's important just to remind ourselves of what that means and the fact that a sound wave actually has multiple properties. And we tend to think of this as the movement of particles under pressure over time. So the first thing that we're interested in is the amplitude of a sound wave. And this is basically the height of that wave. And you can measure the height just from where it hits the x-axis, or you can do what's known as a peak-to-peak amplitude measurement, where you measure the full height of that wave from the peak to the trough. And very broadly, you can think of this as the amplitude changes, the volume of the sound changes. So when you have a flatter or a lower amplitude, you tend to have a quieter sound. And when you have a higher amplitude or a higher wave, you have a louder sound. Then we have our wavelength, which is the distance from basically where the wave starts to where it ends or where it begins again. And very broadly, we can think of this as waves that tend to be less frequent per unit time, have a lower pitch or a lower frequency, and waves that are more frequent or happen more often per unit time have a higher pitch, or they sort of sound higher in frequency. Now, mainly in zoos, I would say 90% of the time when people are trying to measure sound in zoos, they're measuring the loudness. So they're measuring the amplitude of that sound wave. And the decibel is the gold standard way in which we've been doing this. So this tells you the amplitude, height, or the general loudness of the sound that's occurring. And this is a really quick and easy thing to do. You can just use a handheld meter like the one in this picture, also known as a sound level meter, and it gives a really quick and sort of immediate decibel reading. And you can log decibels without having to actually record the sound. So you don't need a microphone or anything like that. You're just taking a reading of the loudness. And as I said, most zoo studies do this. I've just put two examples of zoo biology papers, which have mainly relied on decibels, although the bottom paper also did include frequency measurement as well. But typically, when you're doing a zoo study, you will be measuring decibel levels. But there are several problems I'd like to draw your attention to when it comes to measuring decibels. The first problem is that the decibel is not what we call a true unit, like a unit of length or mass. It's actually a unit that's very difficult to work with because it's relative to a reference level. And that means what a decibel is in the air is different to what a decibel is in water. And also the depth or the height of which you're in the water or the air changes what a decibel is. So it all gets very complicated. And for that reason, decibel comparison across different studies, or if you're working at different enclosures, different zoos, is very tricky unless you use exactly the same measurements. Decibels are also measured on a log scale, which means that it's quite difficult to analyze them using our traditional statistics. And the difference between 0 and 10 decibels is 10 times smaller than the difference between 10 and 20 decibels. So it all gets very confusing very quickly. And because of this, studies have tended to focus on just the peak loudness or the highest decibel that they were able to measure, regardless of how often or how long that decibel level was reached. As well as decibels, as I said, we also have frequency. We have the frequency of the waves per unit time. So this is also a nice measurement that you can take. But this is tricky as well, because different species have different hearing capacities. They hear in different frequency ranges. And this infographic just summarizes that for you. So typically human hearing goes from about 20 to 20,000 hertz. Frequency is typically measured in hertz, whereas something like a bat or a dolphin, they have much higher frequency hearing than we do. So there is an overlap between what we can hear and what they can hear, but the majority of what they can hear, we cannot hear. So you just have to bear this in mind as well, that you need to understand what your animals can physically hear. Now, luckily, what we can do is we can account for different hearing ranges in our different species that we're working with at the zoo by applying a decibel weighting or a filter onto our decibel logger. So that picture I showed you of the meter that we're using, the handheld meter to record decibels, you can actually on a lot of those decibel loggers apply a filter that will simulate the hearing range of the species that you're working with. Now, of course, this relies on you knowing what that hearing range is, and that can be difficult when we work with exotic animals. Hearing ranges are well known for laboratory primates, laboratory rodents. For humans, obviously, there's been quite a lot of work in bats and dolphins, some in domestic cats and dogs, but other than that, we don't really know what the hearing ranges of different species are. So you tend to sort of need to extrapolate from the ones that you do know. So if you can find the closest related species that you have a published hearing range for, you can sort of maybe extrapolate what your animal in your zoo can hear. And so there's different weightings. In the work that I've done, I've mainly used the dBA weighting because this closely simulates what humans and other primates can hear. And then there's also specialized weightings that I've used when I've worked with marine mammals, so mainly dolphins, because they have really, really high frequency hearing. The next thing you can do is try and visualize what you collected. So there's three main types of graph that you might be plotting if you really get into sound measurement and you're really keen on it. So you can plot an oscillogram, a power spectrum, and a spectrogram. And hopefully, just to go over this quite quickly, hopefully you can see that they produce very different looking data. So if you're interested in how the amplitude is changing over time, that's your oscillogram. If you're interested in how the power and the frequency are sort of correlated, then that would be a power spectrum. And then your spectrogram turns your frequencies into lovely color codes as well. So you can either have like lower frequencies represented by darker colors or vice versa. It really depends on how you want your graph to look. So I've just put on this slide here examples of those three graphs taken from three very different types of zoo recording. So it's a nice way of visualizing the sound that you're actually measuring. Now, in a zoo, as in any environment really, your sound is going to interact with the environment. So that's another important thing to remember. So you're going to have in a zoo a mixture of natural substrates and man-made substrates like concrete and glass. So in order to measure sound in a zoo, you have to sort of understand things like reverberation. So that's when your sound is going into a confined space and bouncing around off all the walls and the floor. Then some materials in your environment might absorb that sound, or they might reflect it, or there could be something more nuanced like diffusion. So even though you might be interested in sound primarily, you might also have to do a little bit of background research into the properties of different materials in the animal's enclosure and whether they're likely to have any of these sort of physical phenomena happening. Now moving on to sound and animal welfare. So I'll be quite brief with this section, because actually, as I said at the beginning, this is an area of research that is developing. It's in development, really. So most of what we know about the effect of sound on animal welfare comes from a laboratory setting. So it's not particularly pleasant research that's been done on laboratory animals exposed to very, very loud sounds or sounds that vibrate a lot. But in general, what we know is most of the effect that we know of sound on animal welfare is to do with cognition and behavior. So it can really vary from just quite benign avoidance behavior and some quick fear responses, right the way up to sort of more serious things like the animal becoming disorientated, not being able to navigate, not knowing where it is in space. Then there's something called the Lombard effect, which is to do with how the animal communicates or changes its communication on the basis of noise in the background. So a lot of research has been done on laboratory primates and the Lombard effect. And then we also know about a range of cognitive issues, such as impaired problem solving. In terms of physiology, noise, very loud or annoying noise, is associated with increased levels of stress cortisol and increased heart rate. And it also has lots of effects on just general hormone balances, which can disrupt things like the sleep cycle. In terms of physical injury, there's been some research on tissue damage. Again, this comes from the laboratory setting, not the zoo setting, but tissue damage caused by very loud sounds, because the louder the sound, the more it's going to be vibrating, and even damage to hearing structures. And then there is a little bit of research on death that has been caused to animals due to too much noise in their environment. So with all of this said, hopefully, if you didn't think it already, you do now sort of see the value of studying sound in zoo environments, because it can have a suite of effects on welfare. Now, you might be asking, well, how loud is too loud? If we know that loud sound has all these problems for animal welfare, can you give me a decibel level at which, you know, that's the cutoff and we shouldn't go above that decibel level? And I would love to tell you what that decibel level is, but again, it really depends on what species you're working with, because of those hearing ranges. Some sound could be loud, but if an animal can't hear it, then it can't hear it. So you have to think about not only the decibel level, but also the frequency of that sound and if it's actually audible. Now, interestingly, there's this range that keeps getting cited in the zoo literature. Around about 60 to 85 decibels is the cutoff that researchers have cited as the threshold level of sound in zoo studies, above which they would say that is unacceptable for animal welfare. But this appears to be based on human health in workplaces, so from occupational health literature. So it's not really massively relevant to most of the species we have in zoos, potentially all the primates that we have. But beyond that, you have to ask the question of whether this 60 to 85% decibel level is a little bit arbitrary. And it's also very important to remember, as I said, because decibels are on a log scale, the difference between, as the decibel level increases, the magnitude is massively increasing. So, for example, a 20 decibel increase from 60 to roughly 80 decibels is actually 100-fold increase in loudness. So, as your decibel levels increase, basically, they become massively, massively louder. And also, some species actually are really loud in themselves. So there's been some really interesting research recently. For example, this paper by 𝗙𝗆𝗿𝗆 et al. A couple of years ago, which is a really lovely list of the loudest species that we know about. So many land birds and mammals can actually make normal vocalizations that go up to 125 decibels. So they are themselves creating quite a lot of the noise. And if you're wondering what the loudest animal is, so the pistol shrimp is really loud, and then we also have the water boatman, which is apparently the world's loudest animal, if we correct for its small body size. So that's just to point out that it's not just the humans that are making the sound in zoos, it's also the animals themselves. But I will caveat that by saying that the fact that the animals are captive means that they cannot avoid these sort of loud sounds as they would in the wild. So even though animals are noisy, so you could sort of blame the noise on the animals, the fact that they cannot move out of those confined spaces in captivity is certainly our fault as humans. So we need to weigh up these things, that yes, animals are loud, but also we are confining them in spaces where the built environment or the substrates are not typically as they would be, and therefore the sounds are not behaving as they would be in a natural setting. So now with all that background information, I'm going to start talking more practically about some of the sound measurement techniques that you could use in your zoo. So maybe you are a zookeeper or a zoo researcher, you could be a university-based researcher, maybe you're a student or a zoo volunteer. So I'm going to try and cover a really wide audience here. So Jake Dunn from Anglia Ruskin University and I published a paper last year that really tried to convince zoos and other captive animal settings that they should be moving away from decibel measurement, if possible, or at least replacing some of the decibel measurement with other bioacoustic methods, because of all those aforementioned problems I talked about with just measuring decibels. So the key points we made in our paper were things like the decibel is not a true unit, so it's difficult to compare decibels within and between different enclosures and zoos. We don't know at this stage how loud is too loud for most species in our zoos due to a lack of research. And also focusing on decibels ignores the biological meaning or relevance for animals. So if we're just focusing on how loud it is, we're ignoring what that sound means and the information in that sound. So because of that, Jake and I proposed a different approach, which is where you should be measuring sound in 3 different ways. So the first way is to measure animal sound. So you're just measuring the sound that is produced by the animal, and you can use this in zoos to infer the presence, distribution, behavior, or welfare of your animal or animals. The second approach is to measure sound in the environment, so the background that surrounds the animal in their enclosure. And this involves analysing the content, which is the complexity and the naturalness of the overall soundscape. And I'll explain what I mean by soundscape coming up. And the third approach is a hybrid approach where you measure both the animal and the environmental sound simultaneously. And you do this to try and understand the effect of that sound on that animal. So what that animal's doing and how that animal is responding. So let's take a look at those 3 approaches in a little bit more detail. I'm going to give you some examples of previous literature, previous research that was done, and the methods that they used that you could use in your zoo. So the first one is a study that was done on a herd of farmed goats. And what they wanted to do was to try and understand what the goats were doing without having to watch them, so they could basically save time and energy, really. So rather than having people standing and watching your large groups of animals, can you just use sound to monitor what they're doing? And in this study, they did that by collecting the sounds that the jaw of the animals make and inferring that they're feeding when the jaw sounds are occurring. So for this type of study, you need a microphone actually on the animal, preferably, so you could have it on their collar. In this case, they had it mounted or stuck onto their forehead, sometimes onto their horn worked better. And then you are going to need to do some complicated computer stuff. So in this case, it was machine learning to actually detect the sound of the goats feeding. This was a nice study that was done on zoo-housed killer whales, where they just put a hydrophone into the tank, and hydrophones are really easy to get hold of these days. They've really dropped in value, so they're getting cheaper, easier to use. And in this study, they were able to describe all the different vocalizations that were occurring and the fact that they were different depending on who was doing it in the orcas, using spectrograms. So spectrograms can be produced for free. There's free software that you can get now to produce spectrograms. So you can hopefully see that this has a lot of other applications in a zoo setting. And then there was this one as well. So this was an N=1 study. This was just a one female slow loris in a zoo, and the keepers wanted to monitor her estrus state or her reproductive state. And they did that by recording her whistles. So they just put a sound recorder in the enclosure, and they used a bit of software that performed pulse train analysis, which is special software analysis to count the number of whistles. So these studies are sort of using technology so that people don't just have to stand there watching their animals all day and night. You can use sound to your advantage. Other applications of this sort of thing, you might be interested in detecting the vocalizations of animals that you can't see very well in your zoo. Maybe they're nocturnal or they're cryptic. Maybe they could be stressed by your physical presence. You might want to monitor specific stress-related vocalizations. So maybe your species makes a particular sound when it's stressed. Again, this is good for cryptic or nocturnal vocal species. You might want to do something called cue counting, which is where you count the frequency of sounds that the animal's making per unit time, and you use that as a proxy for their density or their behavior. This is great for large flocks or herds, again, where you might not be able to individually identify animals. You can go by the number of different sounds that you can hear instead. And then another proposal I have is for someone, I've not done this, I'm just putting this out there as an idea, something called sound marks. So sound marks are the familiar sounds that animals make to help orient themselves. So they're a little bit like contact calls that you might get in meerkats, for example. That's an example of a sound mark. So I think it would be really interesting if someone looked at the value of sound marks in captive animals to see if they're less important when you're in a confined space. Now moving on to measuring the sound in the environment and the sounds and what the animal is doing, sorry. So here was an example, again, in a zoo study where the researchers were interested whether all the sounds going on in the environment of the animals, such as the water filtration system and just general bangs and crashes, whether those were impacting dolphins or not. So they did this by understanding what the hearing range was of a dolphin using an audiogram. So an audiogram is a graph of what your animal can hear. They used hydrophones again and spectrograms again, and they were able to determine from this study that most of the enclosure sounds were lower than the dolphins could hear, so they were at a lower frequency. So even though they sounded really bad and annoying to us as humans, the dolphins couldn't hear them. And then a study in the lab actually gave zebrafish, which is a common laboratory species in lots of animal research projects. They gave these zebrafish a choice of different sound levels by creating like a gradient of different sounds, and they looked to see basically where the zebrafish chose to spend most of their time, and then they used this information to create some soundproofing for the various laboratory tanks. And this is a plug really for some research that I did with Jake again and Fina, who's my PhD student at Anglia Ruskin. She's working at Jersey Zoo. So this was a study that Fina and the rest of us published this year, which was trying to understand whether background noise was having a detrimental impact on the pied tamarins at Jersey Zoo. And she came up with a lovely experimental design of playing the sounds of like gardening sounds, so like lawn mowers and hedge trimmers, that sort of thing, through some speakers, which allowed us to have really tight control over that sound. So that's why we played it to the tamarins in speakers rather than just letting it happen. And then she gave them a cognitive task when that sound was present and when it was absent, to see whether having that background sound would impact their ability to do that task. And she found that they could still do the task and they were still just as successful on the task. It didn't impact their success, but just the timing of them doing the task did change. So the tamarins preferred to do the task sort of more quickly, sort of almost like to get it over with, I would say. So that shows that the tamarins have adapted their foraging strategy to suit the noise that happens every day in their enclosure. Other examples of projects that you could do at your zoo, you might have old enclosures that are due for repair, and maybe your zoo has said we don't have the budget to make a new enclosure, but you can have some, I don't know, soundproofing foam or something. So you could do a study to see the difference of using that soundproofing method on your animals. So that would be like a before and after type of study. You might be interested to know whether your animals are affected by the heating, ventilation and air conditioning systems that you have that are going on all day and all night. Or you might have animals, again, this is a study I haven't done, but I'd be really happy to help someone do this type of study if you're interested, which is the effect of noise and vibration on the animals when they're moving between zoos. So as I'm sure you know, animals are constantly moving between different collections or even different enclosures, and we haven't, to my knowledge, really looked at the effect of noise and vibration in that particular period of time. And then the third approach is the soundscape. So this is where we're taking more sophisticated measures of sound from sound. And a soundscape is thinking about the sounds in a zoo as an acoustic scene or an acoustic environment in its totality. So it's an ensemble of all the sounds that I mentioned sort of on my second slide. So it's the biophonic, geophonic and anthrophonic sounds, all of them, all together at the same time. And this is really advanced because, as I said, we tend to just think about loudness, regardless of where the loudness is coming from. Whereas if we move towards a soundscape approach, we're thinking of, okay, forget if it's loud, what is it comprised of? What are those different categories that are making up what the animal can hear? And this is what we call a 𝗙𝗆lt viewpoint. So in other words, it's thinking of sound as an emergent property that's different from the sum of its parts. Again, this is better than using decibel levels, because decibels, because they're measured in a log scale, you can't add them up. It's not 𝗙𝗆lt when you're working with decibels. So how do we look at the soundscape? How do we analyze the soundscape? So what you're going to need to do is record the actual sound that's happening in the environment. So rather than use a decibel logger, you're going to need to take actual sound recordings using a microphone, and then you put that into a piece of software, which will then crunch the numbers and give you a value. It creates what we call an acoustic index, and the acoustic index is a summary of that sound recording. Now that sounds really confusing and difficult to do, but it's getting a lot simpler because more and more people are starting to do this. There's two types of index that you can use. The first is alpha, which measures the richness or the complexity of your soundscape. So in other words, the number of different sounds that comprise your soundscape. And then the beta index is a measurement of, it compares two soundscapes. So for example, if you're doing a study, say COVID lockdown versus full busy weekend soundscape, you could use a dissimilarity index to compare the composition of those two soundscapes. So here's just one example of soundscape analysis being used to estimate the number of injury lemurs that were taking part in a big group chorus. So they were all singing together, and you could use soundscape analysis to determine how many individuals or how many different singers there were in that chorus. Another great example is from Chester Zoo, who published a study this year So they indeed assessed the zoo soundscape in the presence and absence of zoo visitors. So they compared the soundscape in aviaries across the zoo when the zoo was open as normal, and then during periods of COVID lockdown. And using the methods that I've just told you about, they were able to sort of understand more scientifically the effect of human presence on the soundscape, so what humans are doing to the soundscape of the animals. And they found, maybe not surprisingly, that aviaries were a lot quieter during the 2020 pandemic lockdown. But the interesting thing was the level of biophony. So when the human level was going down, the ability to hear the pick apart various species that we're calling increased. So that was a really lovely paper. Now, I hope you're not thinking, oh, these methods sound like a complete nightmare. They're too difficult. There's no way I could do anything like that in my zoo. I best just stick to decibels. I want to encourage you not to do that. I don't want to put anyone off. And in fact, all these bioacoustic methods are just waiting for us to harness them in a zoo setting. And there's loads of people who work in bioacoustics in wild animals at universities who you can collaborate with, who have a shared interest in conservation and who want to use their technology and to pilot and develop their technology. And zoos are perfect places to do that. So it can be a win-win situation. You could have a study happening in your zoo using these sophisticated measures. Not only are you helping your animals, but you could be helping species conservation in the wild as well. So you just basically need to get in touch with people at your local universities, or you can contact me, or there's quite a few of us who have started to get into bioacoustics who work in zoos, and we can all collaborate and do it together. I'm going to end by talking about some sort of specific tips that I have if you just want to do something maybe a little bit easier to begin with and want to monitor noise in your zoo. So my top tips, I'll just read them out for monitoring noise if you have what you consider a problem noise in your zoo. First of all is to measure sound from the animal's ear when possible. So as much as you possibly can, what the animal can hear is what you want to record. So it has to be the correct frequency that the animal can hear, and it has to be in the same location as the animal. So there's no point setting up a logger or a microphone like 20 meters away from where the animal actually lives, because that's not representative of what the animal can hear. Given taxonomic differences in hearing frequency, if you're working with more than one species, you need to record decibels at both low and high frequencies. But this is particularly important if you're working with a mixed species enclosure. 3, I would highly recommend that you log decibels and take actual recordings of sounds. So you'll need 2 bits of equipment for this. You'll need your decibel logger. This can be handheld, so you literally hold it in your hand, or you can attach it to an enclosure wall or something. And then the second bit of kit is an audio moth or something like an audio moth. So if you haven't heard of an audio moth, I encourage you to go and Google that afterwards. So it's a sort of open access kit. They're becoming very readily used in lots of settings, and it's essentially just a tiny audio recorder. So you set it up, you let it record the sound, and then you bring it back to your laptop and you upload that sound recording. Very, very straightforward, easy to do. If you're interested in a particular sound event, so perhaps you have a concert going on in your zoo or some other special event, don't forget to make sound recordings before, during, and after the event so that you can make a reliable comparison between the effect of that sound absent and present. Keep a really detailed protocol or list of your methods so that other zoos can replicate what you've done. That's particularly important if you're using decibels, because the decibel measures that you got depend on how you recorded them. If you're interested in trying to measure noise against a threshold level, So for example, if you think that a particular threshold level, like, I don't know, 65 decibels is the limit, take the frequency and the duration of your recording hitting that threshold into account, because both are important. And then just be really careful if you're doing any recordings near humans, because that's an ethical problem. And there was a paper published on this recently. And by the way, I'm going to write a nice reference list for this talk. If anyone's interested, you can email me for my reference list so I can give you all these resources. But I'll put that one in. But this is an issue that's come to light recently, that when you're recording the sounds of zoo animals, you may accidentally record the conversations of visitors and keepers, which is an ethical dilemma. So that needs to be approached carefully. Yeah, sorry, that little graphic there is a risk matrix. So again, this is tying into it's how often the sound level occurs and how dangerous that potential sound level is, that you have to take into account when you're trying to monitor noise for animal welfare purposes. If you need any more advice or would like a deep dive into any of the things that I've covered in this talk, this is Jake and I's paper that came out open access last year. So you should freely be able to get this if you just Google the title. So yeah, it breaks down everything that I'm talking about today in far more detail. And then finally, this is a really brief point just on acoustic enrichment. I don't think I've ever done an acoustic enrichment study myself, but I understand that they're very popular. So I thought I'd just give you some tips that are, disclaimer, they're things that appear logical to me, but they're not based on my actual experience, because I don't have any actual experience in this particular area. But just like any other type of enrichment, I'd really urge you not to assume that any sound is enriching. So just because you have like an MP4 recording of like rainforest sounds that come from the habitat that your animal naturally comes from, do not make the mistake of assuming that that will be a natural and enjoyable sound for your animal, because they've not been in that environment themselves throughout their lives. So you have to put in the legwork to prove that that sound is actually impactful on that animal's welfare. Give your animals as much choice and control over the sound exposure as you possibly can. So I do actually have some research coming up in the future on this aspect of giving animals more choice and control over what they can hear. So logical things: don't fill a whole enclosure with the sound, because then your animal can't escape because it's literally captive. Allow your animals to avoid the sound if they choose, so give them quiet areas that they can retreat to, and if you can, try and give them some control. So that's easier said than done though, isn't it? But there's maybe ways in which you can do that. So for example, training the animals to switch the sound on and off. Obviously choose a sound based on your species' known hearing ranges if you do know them. If you don't know them, then look in the literature for the nearest equivalent. So you might have to look in the laboratory literature for that. And then finally, you don't need to blast out these sounds really loud. Just choose a low to moderate decibel level when playing different sounds in a captive environment, because of the reverberation or the emphasis that can occur when you're working in enclosures. So that brings an end to my talk. I have a number of people to thank, mainly at Anglia Ruskin University, but also Twycross Zoo and Jersey Zoo and the UK Acoustics Network. And then this slide just acknowledges the various pictures that I used on all of my slides. So yeah, that's it from me. I finished a teeny tiny bit earlier than I was expecting to, but that gives us plenty of time for questions.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much, Faye. That was a really great talk, and it was really nice to have some of those kind of your thoughts on how we can go about doing things in zoos as well. So we have got a few questions come in. I think I'll go to Leah first, if you want to unmic, Leah, and then ask. I think Leah's got a couple of questions actually.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. Thank you very much, Fay, for your talk. It was really interesting. My first question was about I'm expecting sounds to add up in terms of effect on animal behavior and maybe animal welfare. Like if I have two very annoying noises, it's going to be have a stronger effect on my behavior or the behavior of my animals. But do you have any information on if sounds can cancel each other out? Because we have, so I'm working with teams and helps you to implement welfare assessments and evaluate the welfare of the animals. And in some zoos, they have waterfalls and like very powerful one. And the keepers tend to sometimes just turn on and turn off the waterfalls based on if there are like a lot of visitors and they are very, very noisy and they have the feeling that the waterfalls sound can kind of cancel out the noise made by the visitors. Or if, for instance, in species who are very, very noisy, like penguins or parrots that live in very noisy colonies, the keepers sometimes feel like they cannot really hear the sounds that are made by the equipment, the HVAC or things like that.
Yeah, these all sound like really common questions, which is good. So yes, sounds can definitely mask other sounds. But it's really interesting that a mask for one species might be an irritating noise for another species. So for example, like you mentioned, a zoo waterfall, it really has to be done on a species by species level, case by case basis as to whether that sound is going to be irritating background noise or something that covers up irritating background noise. So I guess the way to really answer that question is to take measurements from the animal's behavior or welfare in the presence of each sound singly and also in combination. So my PhD student is actually doing research that sounds very similar to your question at the moment. So she's been looking at different combinations of things happening alone and in combination with each other. So if there's like an interaction effect. The closest thing that I can think of that's already been published is by Jason Waters from Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago, who looked at the effect of a waterfall on pied tamarin behavior to see whether it was something they could hear or not, and whether indeed it was sort of masking something that was more irritating. Because as you say, we tend to use the sound of water thinking that it's going to be enjoyable for the animals or mask something else that is irritating to them. But it's not always the case. So yeah, I would definitely refer you to Jason's research on that topic.
Thank you very much. Should I ask the second question, Eleanor?
Yes, go for it, and then we'll go to the others.
Oh, okay. My other questions was about so if I have to measure the sounds as closely as possible from where my animal actually live, how do you protect your equipment? And does do you have to be careful with the material that you're using? Because I'm guessing it's going to affect the sounds recording if I don't know if I use a box that is completely closed, or I don't know.
Yeah, this is a really good question, because often the protective housing that you try to put around your microphone, for example, if you try to put your microphone in the middle of an enclosure, the housing can cause reverberation. So the measurement of sound that you get is not a fair representation of what it would be in the open air. So for this reason, sometimes what I've done is I've tried to correct the decibel level or sound recording that I've collected. So if you, for example, if you go into the enclosure and take a decibel reading and a sound recording where your animal would normally be when they're safely locked out of the way, so you can do so, then you take a sound at the fence line, which is where your recording equipment is then normally going to go. You can calculate the difference between where the animal would have been and what you're recording safely over the side of the fence. So you can sort of take that decibel change into account. Does that make sense? So rather than having to have your precious recording equipment in with the actual animals, you just take one measurement of the sound where the animals would be, and then afterwards you apply that correction or that difference in decibel to your actual recordings. So it just takes quite a lot of preparation, I guess, to work out what that is.
Okay, thank you very much.
Fabulous, thanks, Faye. We've got loads of questions. I don't think we're going to get through all these questions, but let's try. So I've got a couple that I've just been asked to read out, so I'll do these so they don't get lost, if that's okay. So we've got one from Rachel. Well, two from Rachel actually. So Rachel says, in regards to knowing what is too loud, is there research or is there a way to research this without causing the animal too much distress with the noise? And then she also asks if decibels are still a good way to track noise levels and how it impacts on animals if you're just studying one species.
Oh yeah, so this good old age-old question, how loud is too loud? Now, in my opinion, it's fundamentally unethical in a zoo setting to try and work out how loud is too loud on purpose. So if you want to just be around collecting decibel levels that are naturally occurring, so perhaps you have building activity going on in your zoo or an event, and you can take advantage of that by just recording the decibel levels as they rise and your animal's response in concert, that's absolutely fine, okay, because you're not doing that. But what I wouldn't say on ethical grounds is that you purposely expose your animals to those sounds just to find out how loud is too loud. So you sort of understand the idea. You can do a naturalistic experiment to just measure them as and when they happen, then that might give you an idea of your animal's own threshold, but I would never suggest that you purposefully do that experiment. And then the other question, so yeah, if you're trying to measure volume levels or sound pressure levels, it's going to have to be decibels. That is the only way to do it. You just have to do things like apply a filter to your data logger so that you're measuring decibels relative to what your animal's hearing range is, and just be really, really careful when you come to analyze or summarize those decibels, because they're not on a log scale as other numbers typically are. So you might get tripped up in your interpretation of what those decibels mean. But yeah, decibel levels are still the gold standard way of measuring noise.
Super, thank you very much. One more for me to read out, and then we've got some people that I think are going to come onto the mic. So does the type of sound affect, sorry, this is from Jenny, does the type of sound affect animals as differently as they do to us, e.g. like a shrill noise being aversive? And is there much variability between individual animals as well, rather than sort of whole species? So do we see individual variability?
Yeah, so the first thing, so I guess that's on a species level. Yeah, again, this ties into what your animal can actually hear. So when I used to work with dolphins, for example, I was a dolphin trainer in a previous life. The people that I was working with told me that I had to communicate the dolphins with a really shrill baby voice. And to me, it sounded awful and I didn't want to do it. But then I appreciate that the dolphins could barely hear that as high as I could possibly get my voice. The dolphins would hear that as like the lowest thing they'd ever heard. So yeah, there are massive species differences. What sounds awful to us might sound barely perceptible to an animal. And then individual differences, absolutely. So species that I've studied, for example, gorillas, there are massive individual differences by sounds that are annoying to animals. sounds that they appear to completely habituate to and don't really pay any attention to. So yeah, not only have we got the challenge of looking at in species by species level, but we also have all these individual differences that might occur, which is particularly important, I think, for acoustic enrichment. So what might be enriching to one animal as a sound isn't necessarily going to be the same for their counterpart in exactly the same enclosure.
Fabulous, thank you very much. I'm going to invite, I think, Joy. Do you want to ask your question, Joy? Maybe?
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, do you think there's any benefit in researching the impact of construction noises on the animals? Because I've had animals that have passed away because they got stressed by sounds, and then they'll run back and forth, and then they'll sort of get infections from the wounds.
So I think, was that a question on construction noise and the value of studying like building sounds? Absolutely, yes. So we've had another PhD student working on that very question. There seems to be a lot of work, a lot of development work going on in zoos at the moment. I know a lot of zoos are doing major construction projects, and that involves months, if not years, of very long periods of drilling, mining, banging, all these sounds. And again, it's an interesting mix between sounds that are quite spontaneous and like almost frightening and shocking, and then they've finished, and then other sounds that go on chronically for days on end. So I think there's a really interesting opportunities here if you have building work going on at your zoo to try and measure the effects of both the acute sounds, so the quick, sharp, short, sharp sounds, and the chronic ones as well, because I imagine that they'll have different welfare effects. This is something that we're currently studying in 2 different zoos, but it's too early to say at the moment what the findings are. But yeah, I definitely encourage any zoo that has building work going on to start monitoring those sound levels.
Super, thanks so much. I think we've got time for maybe one more question. We've got a question come in that I'm reading out for 𝗙𝗎𝗿𝗙 because they're joining from Singapore and have a sleeping baby. So thank you for joining us. So the question is, how about the use of noise cancelling technology against road noise, planes, etc.? Does this have benefit on the animals given that they've got different frequency levels?
That's a wonderful question. So as far as I'm aware, most of the studies that have been done on sound attenuation or sort of soundproofing stuff has been done on marine mammals, and it's sort of come from the Navy, interested in like I don't know, like the shipping noises and things, and if we might be able to reduce the impact of shipping noise on wild marine mammals. So again, I always advise people to think outside the box when they're looking for acoustic literature and look at other species in the wild in other settings, because sometimes you can find these gems that help you. There's not much that's been done or anything that's really been done in a zoo setting as far as I know of. There's been a little bit of work done on animal shelters, so looking at various like soundproofing glass and sound absorbing foam that you can put on the walls of like dog shelters, cat shelters. But I think probably just to sort of round things up, I think zoos are only really recently coming around to the fact that all these noises might actually be a problem. So we're kind of a little bit behind other captive animal settings like farms, labs, pet shelters, in terms of acknowledging sound in all the different forms and the problems that it might raise. So we need to catch up, basically, guys. We need to catch up with the other captive animal settings and start doing this research. But the good news is that other settings have done it, so we can look at their literature, look at their findings, look at what they actually used and apply it in zoo enclosures to see if it has a similar effect.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much. And that was a perfect roundup. So thank you so much, Fay. There are some more questions that we just couldn't fit in. So I've dropped your email address in the chat. So if anyone would like to get in touch with Fay, then please do follow her on Twitter, and the recent paper is in there in the chat as well. So just to finish up, really, is thank you so much, Fay, for your time. Really, very much appreciate it. It was a really fascinating talk, and really useful to have so much practical advice, as well as how we as an industry can go forwards with this. And thank you to everybody for joining the call. I hope you have a lovely rest of day, whatever time of day you're on, and we hope to see you at the next welfare webinar.
Thank you. Bye.